The movie opens up in Domremy, a small village in the northeast of France. A young girl named Joan d'Arc is visiting the confession room of her local church for the third time on this particular day. The priest, clearly tired of seeing her there, asks what terrible crime she has committed. In response, Joan says that she gave a poor man her father's shoes without his permission. The priest points out that charity is not a sin and asks Joan why she's always confessing in the church several times a day. The little girl tells him that she feels safe inside the church. This is when Joan reveals something that raises the priest's curiosity. The girl reveals that she regularly talks to a young boy who commands her to help everyone and take care of herself. The priest advises Joan to listen to what the boy tells her. Following her visit to the church, Joan happily runs around and even rolls along a field of tall grass. It is obvious that she is a very innocent and happy girl who loves her life. She is lost in her own world when suddenly she begins to hear the young boy calling out her name. Joan looks around and to her amazement finds a sword beside her. Rather casually, Joan picks up the sword and points it towards the sky while she is still laying down. The young girl then realizes that she has been transported to a nearby forest. The day is no longer bright but rather dark and maliceful. She tries to make sense of what's happening when suddenly several soldiers on horses seem to be rushing through the forest. On top of that, Joan also sees a pack of black wolves running in her direction. She immediately follows the wolves which lead her to her village, which is being burnt down by the soldiers on horses. Dead bodies are seen on the ground, and the wolves start to feast on them. Joan runs back to her home, where she eventually sees her older sister Catherine, who tells Joan that the English soldiers attacked their village as part of the ongoing war between England and France. Catherine hides Joan in a small room inside their home as English men start to trespass on their home. Joan watches as one of the men kills Catherine and assaults her immediately afterward. When the attacks subside, the surviving villagers bury their lost family and friends. Joan mourns the death of her sister, and eventually, she is taken by two of her distant relatives. They tend to her needs and give her time to rest, but the next day Joan tells them that she wants to see a priest. The couple brings Joan to their local priest, and Joan talks to him about wanting the English to die for killing her older sister. The priest tells Joan that God wants her to learn how to forgive and that God has a plan for sparing her instead of her sister. The priest advises Joan to be patient and wait for God's calling. Joan is furious and tells the priest that she doesn't want to wait for God's calling. She wants the calling to happen now. On the way home, the woman tells her husband that the priest advised her to watch Joan at all times. One rainy day, Joan escapes from home and runs to the church, where she drinks a cup of wine to be one with God. Several years later, in one of the communities in France named Chinon, a message is being delivered to the soon-to-be King of France, Charles VII. The message is from someone introducing herself as the Maiden of Lorraine, who is Joan, who says that she will be in the palace by tomorrow. Joan wants Charles to provide an army at his expense for her to battle the English. Charles's advisors don't want him to meet with her because it feels like a trap, but the king insists. Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, supports his decision on wanting to meet the Maiden of Lorraine. She says that if this woman is really sent by God, Charles would be able to know it immediately as he is a fine judge of character. The next day, the palace prepares for the arrival of the maiden. In order to know if the maiden is a fake, Charles VII sets up a trap by disguising one of his men as the king instead of himself. If the maiden is really sent by God, she will immediately know that the king sitting on the throne is a fake. If she's an assassin, she will kill the wrong king. After setting up Jean d'Aulon as the trap, Charles VII orders the maiden to enter the room. A timid and now grown-up Joan enters the room and walks straight to the throne. She says that the man on the throne is not the king, and she wants to talk to the real king because they cannot afford to lose any more time. One of the king's advisors tells Joan to look for the king among the crowd herself. Joan is able to identify the king, and she hugs him. She tells him that she has a message for him coming from God, but she needs to speak with him alone. Charles VII talks to Joan alone, and Joan tells the king about how she saw God, and God has sent her to deliver a message that she will save France from the enemies, and she will be the one to lead Charles to the altar where he will be crowned as the King of France. The next day, Charles V's counselors expressed their hesitations about Joan. They suggested verifying if Joan is a virgin, just like how she's claiming to be. Charles agrees to this and they immediately set Joan to the test. A woman examines Joan's private part, and she announces that Joan is, in fact, a virgin, amusing Yolande. Afterward, Joan has been provided with an army to lead, an armor, a banner and a new warhorse. They all leave, bound to the city of Orléans. Joan and her army meet Charles VII's half-brother, Lord Dunois. Dunois tells Joan that before they leave for Orleans, he needs to bring the food that Joan brought back to his city. Joan agrees to this. Upon their arrival to the city and providing food to the villagers, the people start to idolize and patronize Joan. Inside Lord Dunois' tavern, Joan says that God's message is that they give the English a chance to surrender in peace. If they don't surrender, they will cross the river and attack the Tourelles. Dunois doesn't agree with the plan, saying that the Tourelles is impregnable and it won't stop the English from attacking the city from the north. Joan gets angry at the men for not believing her because she's a girl, so she decides to cut her hair. Afterwards, she tells Jean to write the last letter to the English about them surrendering in peace. Jean does so, and by nighttime, he sends the letter across the river to the English soldiers, to which they tell Jean that they won't back out. The next morning, Joan and Jean wake up with the French and English soldiers fighting without her. They immediately join the battlefield, and she asks Dunois if he's the one who ordered the attack without her, but Dunois refuses to answer. Joan leads the army to attack the English soldiers, who are now retreating to their side of the river. The English soldiers try closing the drawbridge, but Joan manages to jump across and cut the rope holding the drawbridge, allowing the French soldiers to run across the bridge and attack the English soldiers. Joan's army succeeds in the fight, and Dunois congratulates her for her victory. Dunois asks Joan what her next plan is. Joan tells him that they need to gather a huge army, and they will attack Orléans. After doing so, Joan leads the attack to the Tourelles, where she tells her army that God will give them a bigger victory. They start attacking the high walls of the Tourelles, but they do not stand a chance against all the artillery the English soldiers have. Realizing that the French soldiers are getting killed and losing the battle, Joan runs to the wall and climbs one of the ladders, even though her fellow men are screaming at her not to. When she reaches the top of the ladder, one of the English soldiers shoots an arrow through her chest, causing her to fall. The English soldiers celebrate while the French soldiers retreat. Jean and the other soldiers tend to Joan's bad wound. Joan tells them that they cannot stop fighting, but the men say that she needs to rest and that the physician will arrive soon to treat her wound. Joan tries standing up, but the men push her back. Shortly afterward, Joan seems to die to the shock of the French soldiers. Soon enough, the physician arrives and tells everyone that Joan isn't dead, but rather she's sleeping. Jean confirms this as well, and he informs Lord Dunois of it. Jean says that they need to continue the attack since it is Joan's order, but Lord Dunois disagrees and tells Jean that what Joan did is bad for their army, and he's tired of taking Joan's orders. While resting, Joan dreams about the night she witnessed her sister dying. She wakes up the following morning and hears an Englishman mocking her and the French soldiers. Joan talks to them, and the English soldiers are surprised to see Joan alive. Joan goes back to their base and wakes up all the French soldiers. Joan orders them to put the Tourelles back up, to the confusion of Dunois, Jean, as well as the Englishmen. The Frenchmen push the Tourelles near the English's stronghold and use it to crash the walls open. When the walls bust open, the French armies immediately attack the defenseless English soldiers. During the attack, the head of the English army, named Glasdale, orders one of his men to kill Joan. One of the soldiers, named Gilles de Rais, sees the archer aiming at Joan and immediately blocks the arrow, injuring himself instead of Joan. Dunois uses a huge fire weapon to burn the main door of the English army, and they are able to destroy it. Joan immediately sees another vision in which a man asks her what she's doing to him. Jean soon wakes Joan up from her vision and informs her that they have won the battle. Joan looks around and rather than being happy, she gets frustrated about the price of their glory. She does not like winning when so much blood is shed. Joan tells her peers that they need to head to church and confess to the sins they have committed on the battlefield. They are able to get hold of a priest when Dunois reports to them that thousands of English men are forming up on the far side of the river. He orders Jean that they need to count their men and prepare for another battle that is ensuing. On an open field, where the Frenchmen are facing the Englishmen, Joan tells her army that she will go alone. Joan speaks to the English army and says she has a message from God for King Henry. She orders the English army to retreat because if they don't, they will be buried right then and there. The Englishmen seem to prepare for an attack but eventually retreat to the delight of the French army. Back in the palace, Charles VII hears the news of how Joan was able to drive the whole English army away by herself. King Henry also hears the news of how they lost the city of Orléans to France, and he says that he wants Joan to be burned alive. Joan is celebrated around the palace. After several days, Charles VII has been coronated as the King of France. Joan's army continues to siege the walls of Paris to claim the city over the English army, but Gilles de Rais tells her that the men are tired and that they are outnumbered. Joan orders him to bring out the reinforcements, but Gilles tells her that they don't have reinforcements. King Charles VII did not send the reinforcements Joan had requested because he does not want warfare anymore. Gilles tells Joan that they need to retreat. Back at the palace, Jeanne confronts King Charles about him not sending the reinforcements she asked for. King Charles tells her that he now prefers diplomacy over warfare because it's safer and cheaper. Joan gets furious and walks out of the room. Joan continues to battle at the town of Compiègne, where she is captured by the Burgundian troops, who are pro-English. Later that night, a man named Talbot tells Joan that he will sell her to the Englishmen. The following morning, a bishop named Pierre Cochon informs Joan that the Kingdom of England paid for her ransom instead of the Kingdom of France. He tells her that he will be the one to conduct Joan's trial because she's been charged with heresy. Joan cannot believe that her king did not pay her ransom. On the first day of the trial, Joan tells the bishop that she can only reveal the things she is allowed to speak about based on her visions. The bishop asks her to cooperate, warning that otherwise, he will have no choice but to abandon her to the secular powers. The bishop orders Joan to be taken away. Back in her cell, Joan is confronted by a man who seems to be her conscience. Her conscience makes her question if the things she is claiming as signs are truly sent by God. Joan's trial continues, but she remains firm, refusing to answer questions that she is not permitted to answer according to her visions. One of the English soldiers grows impatient and demands that the bishop deliver a verdict immediately, explaining that the English army is afraid to fight as long as Joan is alive because they believe she can supernaturally influence battles. One day, Joan learns that the clergymen have sought advice from scholars at the University of Paris. These scholars list pieces of evidence and transcripts of Joan's alleged lies. Joan, scared of being burned without a final confession, asks the bishop if he will hear her confession. The bishop agrees, but only if Joan signs a document. Being illiterate, Joan signs without understanding what it says. Unbeknownst to her, the paper states that Joan has recanted every belief for which she has been accused. Joan is returned to her cell, where several Englishmen tear her dress apart. They tell her that if she wants new clothing, she must wear the male garments they have provided. A few moments later, King Henry of England summons Bishop Pierre Cochon. He accuses Joan of witchcraft, claiming that she transformed her female dress into male clothing. King Henry orders the marketplace to be prepared for Joan's execution the next day. Left alone in her cell, Joan confesses to her conscience. She admits that she saw the signs she wanted to see and that she was proud, stubborn, selfish, and cruel. The next morning, at the age of 19, Joan is led to the marketplace, where she is to be burned in front of a crowd. As the flames consume her, the English people watch in silence. 500 years later, Joan of Arc is canonized by the Vatican Church and declared a saint.